Okay, Karen Armstrong, her book The Buddha, Chapter 3, Enlightenment, and this is Section 8 of our A-Level Paper 4 anthology work. Let's read it and then we'll analyse it together. But this, of course, was not the case. Gautama must have nursed himself slowly back to health, and during this time he probably started to develop his own special kind of yoga. He was no longer hoping to discover his eternal self, since he was beginning to think that this self was just another one of the delusions that held people back from enlightenment. His yoga was designed to help him become better acquainted with his human nature, so that he could make it work for him in the attainment of Nibbana. First, as a preliminary to meditation, came the practice of what he called mindfulness, in which he scrutinized his behavior at every moment of the day. He noted the ebb and the flow of his feelings and sensations, together with the fluctuations of his consciousness. If sensual desire arose, instead of simply crushing it, he took note of what had given rise to it and how soon it faded away. He observed the way his senses and thoughts interacted with the external world and made himself conscious of his every bodily action. He would become aware of the way he walked, bent down, or stretched his limbs, and his behavior while eating and drinking, chewing and tasting, in defecating, walking, standing, sitting, sleeping, walking, speaking, keeping silent. He noticed the way ideas coursed through his mind and the constant stream of desires and irritations that could plague him in a brief half hour. He became mindful of the way he responded to a sudden noise or the change in temperature, and so how quickly even a tiny thing disturbed his peace of mind. This mindfulness was not cultivated in a spirit of neurotic introspection. Gautama had not put his humanity under the microscope in this way in order to castigate himself for his sins. Sin had no place in his system, since any guilt would simply be unhelpful. It would embed an aspirant in the ego, and he was trying to transcend. Gautama's use of the words kusala and akusala are significant. Sex, for example, was not listed among the 5 yama because it was sinful, but because it would not help a person reach Nibbana. Sex was emblematic of the desire that imprisoned human beings in samsara. It expended energy that would be better employed in yoga. A bhikkhu refrained from sex as an athlete might abstain from certain foods before an important competition. Sex has its uses, but it was not helpful to one engaged in the noble quest. Gautama was not observing his human nature in order to pounce on his failings, but to become acquainted with the way it worked in order to exploit its capacities. He had become convinced that the solution to the problem of suffering lay within himself, what he called his fathom-long carcass, this body and mind. Deliverance would come from the refinement of his own mundane nature, so he must investigate it and get to know it as intimately as an equestrian learns how the horse he is training. Okay, lots, and it's a very packed little section to look at here. Notice some things that we've looked at already, and so we find this word human nature popping up quite a few times here. His human nature. Okay, human nature there. Where else did we find this word? somewhere down at the bottom here as well. Human beings. What are human beings? Human nature. You can find it, and we'll highlight it a bit later. But we've talked about this already. The idea of anthropology. What is a human person? Is a central question, and it's an essential question to establishing the proper goal of Buddhism and how that contrasts with other goals, say, of Hinduism. Now, let's ask a question here. Is Armstrong, in rejecting a hagiographical insider approach, inventing an unrecognizable secular Buddhist? Well, what a question. What's a hagiography? A hagiography is an account of someone's life that is there to big them up. Autobiographies are often hagiographic in that they pick the best bits. Most of YouTube, most of Twitter, most of Instagram is hagiographic. My perfect life. How amazing am I? And this typically is, hagiographies are produced by insiders, by people who want to wave the flag. And the Buddha had his own hagiographies. The 10 acts of the Buddha from the 2nd century is a hagiography. And Armstrong clearly isn't wanting to write an insider hagiography. Although she's not a Buddhist, she is sympathetic. But she is creating her own construct, her own idea of the Buddha. And she's not an atheist. But I think we could use the word secular about Armstrong. She's a pluralist. Secularism doesn't imply necessarily atheism, but pluralism and secularism, according to the sociology professor Peter Berger, go together. Pluralism and secularism. So she's trying to create a sort of secular Buddha. Now, would this idea of the Buddha be recognizable to normal Buddhist people? What do you think? Or do you prefer the sort of dramatized hagiographic Buddha of the 10 acts of the Buddha? What is realistic? That's the question. She claims she wants to create a realistic account of the Buddha. Gautama must have nursed himself back to health. And during this time, probably. There's a lot of ifs and buts here, where she's trying to create a life of the Buddha, just like the life of Christ, to distinguish between the Jesus of history, or the Buddha of history, and the Jesus of faith, or the Christ of faith, and the Buddha of faith, the Gautama of history, and the Buddha of faith, as it were. But she creates a reasonably plausible explanation of the origin of his teachings. But is she flattening the account to such a degree that it's unrecognizable, just as the lives of Christ were unrecognizable accounts of the life of Jesus, because they tried to take out the supernatural? So we'll read on. During this time, he probably started to develop his own kind of yoga. Well, that's an interesting word there, his own kind of yoga. So we've asked, do you prefer the dramatized version of the Buddha, where he quickly finds himself under the Bodhi tree fighting Mara, or do you prefer some sort of secular idea of the Buddha as a human? Armstrong is exploring, in particular, the third noble truth here, the cessation of dukkha, just as the classical account draws in the way the classical account tries to do this. in the life of the Buddha. What is the cessation of dukkha? It is that suffering can be transcended, and that you reach nirvana as the Sanskrit, or nibbana as the Pali, which is considered the highest state, or the goal, well, at least of Theravada Buddhism, but it's not the goal for everybody quite. If you look at Mahayana Buddhism, and the word comes from two different origins. This word nirvana. So let's crack on. What kind of yoga? Just exactly what was the Buddha's yoga? We don't know. We make assumptions. And lots of traditions try and look back and say, well, our tradition is the kind of yoga that is practiced here. And this whole passage looks at the idea of mindfulness, awareness, or in the Pali, sati. And sati is the seventh in the Eightfold Path, concentration and mindfulness. According to Rupert Gethin, mindfulness should be understood as what allows the awareness of the full range and extent of dhammas. Sati is an awareness of things in relation to things, and hence an awareness of their relative value, applied to the foundations, applied to mindfulness. That's what we're aiming for. Presumably that this means that sati is what causes the practitioner of yoga to remember that any feeling he may experience exists in relation to the whole variety of the world of feeling that may be skillful or unskillful, with faults or faultless, relative to inferior or refined, dark or pure. So, we'll move on. He was no longer hoping to discover his eternal self. Let's just highlight that a second. He was no longer hoping to discover his eternal self. Well, here is the Buddha's Hindu background. The Hindu doctrine of Atman, the self, which is the same as Brahman, and it's only an illusion, the illusion of Mara, that they are different, independent. He was no longer hoping to discover his eternal self. The quest for the Brahmins was to discover the self, the Atman. And while others, the materialists, didn't share that same quest because they didn't believe in the self. It seems the materialist had then had an effect on the Buddha and his teachings, and his turn away from belief in Atman, the soul, to an anatta, the rejection of belief in the soul. So the self is just another one of the delusions. Again, that this self was just another one of the delusions that held people back from enlightenment. It's pretty harsh on his father's religion, on the whole Hindu religion, to say it's a delusion that holds people back from enlightenment. His yoga was designed to help him become better acquainted with his human nature. Interesting little phrase here. His yoga was designed to help him better acquainted with his human nature. Just what was his yoga? His path, his goal, his purpose. If his human nature is not a dualistic nature with a soul, that is eternal and transmigrates. And then the focus is different. It becomes altogether different. And we find a whole different way of doing Buddhism. His yoga was designed to help him better acquainted with his human nature, so that he could work it out in the attainment of Nibbana. Let's look at this. For him, in the attainment of Nibbana. So what is Nibbana? Well, we said Nibbana is the cessation of dukkha, suffering. Nibbana is the highest goal, but only if perhaps of Theravada. Mahayana sees suffering as caused by dualistic thinking. You have to start to differentiate this. The word Nibbana meaning from the nir or nirvana, nir meaning stop and va to blow. So the extinguishing or blowing out of the fires, the three poisons, the fires of desire. Nibbana is to be a cold one. This all sounds very Theravada. And Mahayana would say in the Two Truth doctrine, this is an illusion, a delusion to think that there is such a thing as nirvana, a state to be in, that you can stop desire. Nibbana, nirvana, is the name for this exalted state, the culmination, as it were, of hopefully the product of your meditation. But again, it's very Theravada. Ideas that what is nirvana, it's a difficult thing to describe it, and so Buddhists, particularly Theravada, have used apophatic language. The further shore, the culmination, the higher peak, the truth, the immaculate, the joyful, the utter peace, the wonderful, the pure, the safe refuge. These poetic language is used in describing what is thought to be indescribable. So we read on. First, as a preliminary to meditation, came the practice of mindfulness, sati. What are you doing, Armstrong? I think you're walking this tightrope between traditions. Again, for the Theravada, there can be no dry stream enterers to nirvana. Bhikkhu Bodhi rejects anything other than the two-stage meditation process of calming meditation followed by insight meditation, samantha and vipassana. Now this reads a lot like that. Mindfulness precedes meditation. But the way that mindfulness is described here is much stronger than just mere mindfulness. And again, this next section sounds very Theravada in its emphasis on what the Buddha was doing. And so again, is her construct of the Buddha a Theravada construct of the Buddha, her construct of mindfulness? To what extent is her construct of mindfulness? Is it a popular idea? Is mindfulness today the same as mindfulness in Buddhism? Can you secularize the idea of mindfulness? Those are important questions. Can other religions practice mindfulness? Can you practice as a Christian mindfulness? And different Buddhists would have different answers. Pluralists would say, of course, of course. What is mindfulness? One scholar, Sarf, notes that it has little to do with bare attention, since it entails, among other things, the proper discrimination of, quote, the moral valence of phenomena as they arise. That's an interesting phrase, the moral valence of phenomena as they arise. In popular parlance, mindfulness is the quality in which the mind clearly apprehends experience and observes it in a non-interfering, non-judgmental manner. Normally, each experience we have triggers desires, thoughts, memories, and these prevent us from seeing the experience as it actually is. The purpose of mindfulness meditation is to strengthen the ability to be mindful and then to use it to observe the body, feelings and mind, the contents of the mind. In time, these things become seen as non-substantial, fleeting, impersonal phenomena, and calm detachment towards them arises. Even from the mundane point of view, this has numerous benefits. If this mindful detachment can be maintained in daily life, one can remain unruffled in the face of provocation and develop a more develop more contentment and peace of mind. Thus, the Buddha said, mindfulness is helpful everywhere. Mindfulness has a crucial role to play in the development of wisdom, moreover. So, mindfulness is huge here, and mindfulness is often framed in Theravada ways, and we need to be aware of that. There are scholars, Western scholars, who write about mindfulness, and really they're writing about Theravada mindfulness, as it were. Theravada Samantha meditation that leads to Vipassana meditation. So let's read on a bit further down, and I want to pick out this bit about sin. A little bit further down, we find this passage here, for his sins. What about sin had no place in his system? Any guilt would be unhelpful, as it would embed the aspirant in the ego, and he was trying to transcend. So, here Armstrong is exploring sin, and perhaps correctly finds a distinctive practice, an emphasis in Buddhism that differs particularly from Christianity, but in general from Western religions, Judaism as well. Without a God to be offended, how can we sin? This is a problem actually in Christian theology. A God who doesn't take offense at sin. What then is sin? Is it just offense against other people? And so liberal Christians have a very horizontal view of sin, not a vertical view of sin. And that atonement theories about Jesus all reflect deeper debates about sin. What's happening when we sin? Armstrong perhaps is correctly framing, structuring the Buddha as an Eastern person, well aware of the Hindu, the pre-Buddhist idea of karma, karmic debt, karmic formation, and the gaining of karmic merit. The universe is not offended at our actions. It's impersonal. It doesn't get angry at us, doesn't get happy at us. So sin has no place not only in Buddhism, but in Hinduism and in most Eastern religions, really. So, Gautama's system. What is Gautama's system? In his system, we've had this word system mentioned earlier. His special kind of progress up at the top here. Gautama's in his system, just as we've had it mentioned up higher. His kind of yoga. We have it here, his system. What is Gautama's system? It's a really interesting question, and it depends on his anthropology. It depends on his view of human nature. And if the Buddha had borrowed from the materialists and had borrowed from the ascetics, the ajivākas and the materialists, then his system borrows but is innovative. It creates new practices with a new goal. If we're not trying to get the soul to transmigrate, what are we trying to do? Gautama's use of the word kusala and akusala here is also significant. Kusala and akusala just here is significant. Now, interestingly that Karen Armstrong is highlighting it. She's saying, in case you don't get it, it's significant. Here she is, significant. Is it? Do you agree? Is skillful and unskillful significant? Well, yes, it is. But what you mean by that? It's nice that she says it's significant. It's significant to everybody. For Theravada, being skillful means being skillful enough to renounce the householder life and become a Buddhist monk. Renunciation. In Mahayana, skillful means upya. It means being prepared to do whatever it takes to help others in a compassionate way, even to lie to them, as in the burning house parable. It's certainly significant to all the different traditions. That's nice that you said that, but she's again not taking sides in these debates. Why is it significant? Which is it? Well, she doesn't say, but she does give us an example from sex. And that's interesting. Sex, for example, was not listed among the 5 yama. The 5 yama. Well, let's pause and think about this phrase, the 5 yama here. Because it was sinful. Okay, there's the word sinful again. But what are the 5 yama? Can mindfulness be decontextualized in the pluralist way that Armstrong seems to suggest? I don't think so. Armstrong here is perhaps confusing Theravada bhikkhu practice and lay rules with Mahayana tantric ideas, which include an albeit rarely sexual yoga, but the bhikkhu rules. In Mahayana, sex is not impossible, even for monks and nuns. Tantric practices. Now, the 5 yamas that's mentioned here are perhaps where the Buddha got the 5 precepts, and they begin with non-violence, ahimsa. And this is in Hindu thought. This is not the same as Buddhism. Ahimsa, non-violence, number 1. Number 2, satya, truthfulness, non-falsehood. Well, remember the second of the 5 precepts is stealing, don't steal. In the Hindu yamas, ashya, non-stealing, is 3rd. In the Hindu yamas, brahmacharya, chastity, marital fidelity, or sexual restraint is 4th. Well, that would be 3rd in a way in Theravada. Api in Buddhism in general. And then 5th, non-avarice, non-possessiveness, whereas in Buddhism the 5th precept becomes intoxication. That's not mentioned. So Buddhists talking about the 5 restraints and precepts, not the yamas. But let's think about sex and the Buddhist monks. She's making a very interesting kind of argument here that it's the Theravada practice of the monks that is more important than the Mahayana. And Theravada rules for the monastery with Mahayana tantric ideas